Z-Wave, or Z-Wave if you prefer, is a wireless protocol specifically designed for smart home devices. And you can take advantage of it in Home Assistant if you've got the right hardware and you know how to configure it. It's more reliable and it's more secure than using Wi-Fi devices, because these devices are going to be connecting to Home Assistant on a completely different protocol at a completely different frequency, and they won't have access to the internet, so they can't leak any information out and they can't be accessed over the internet either. But they also form their own wireless mesh, which makes it a lot more reliable than your typical Wi-Fi network, where adding devices to a Wi-Fi network only slows things down. So how do you take advantage of Z-Wave in Home Assistant? How do you actually set it up and configure it? Well, if that's something you're interested in finding out, then stick around and watch this video, because that's what we'll be going over. Now, whether you're running Home Assistant on a physical computer or on a virtual machine, chances are you're going to need something similar to this. This is an AOTEC Z-Stick. It's a USB dongle that will give the computer access to the Z-Wave network and allow it to talk to your Z-Wave devices. It doesn't necessarily have to be that particular one. There are other manufacturers out there. AOTEC just happens to be a well-known brand for Z-Wave technology. One thing to bear in mind is that if you live in the US, there's actually a device out there that supports both Z-Wave and Zigbee. Now, I can't comment on that myself, because unfortunately the actual frequency used by Z-Wave does vary around the world. So I live in the UK, so I've got to make sure that any Z-Wave device I purchase is compatible with Europe. So ideally what you should do is purchase Z-Wave devices from a vendor within your own country. But if you do purchase them from abroad, then do make sure that they're actually compatible with your country. So for instance, if I were to purchase that specific device that supports both Zigbee and Z-Wave, then yes, it'll still work with Zigbee, but it won't be able to work with any of the Z-Wave devices that I've got. It just can't talk to them. Likewise, if I purchased a Z-Wave device from, say, America, then it wouldn't be able to work over here with this particular Z-Stick that I've got, because they're working on different frequencies. So that's something to bear in mind. But other than that, it's just a case of plugging it actually into your computer, and then after that we can start to take advantage of it. Now, if you've plugged in your USB device and Home Assistant isn't recognizing it, in other words, you're not getting this notification, then I would suggest skipping ahead to the next section, which is where I'll cover the manual process of adding in a USB device. But if, like me, you're using one of these AOTEC Z-Sticks, for instance, and Home Assistant's actually prompting you for this notification, then we can go through a much simpler process of installation. So what I'm going to do here is click on Notifications, and then I'll click on the link, check it out. Once it catches up, just ring a bit slowly. And as you can see, it's prompting me here to say it's made a discovery for Z-Wave JS. What I can then do is just click on Configure. So it's referencing the device that it's identified, and it says, do you want to install the Z-Wave JS add-on? So notice we're under the integrations section here, but this is referring to the add-on because ultimately what we want is an integration for all of the devices to integrate, but we need the actual add-on software itself. So this is going to install the add-on, then it's going to install the integration, and then once that's all completed, we'll be able to get access to devices and start adding them. But you've got to start somewhere. In this case, I'm going to click on Submit to get the process started, and it'll start installing the actual add-on. Now the installation has finished, and it's now asking us to put in some security keys as part of the configuration. Now if this is a completely new installation, like it suggests, you can leave these empty and it'll create completely new ones. Alternatively, you can actually create ones yourself. So these are just random letters and numbers. To make life easier, it's easy to just leave them empty, let the system generate them for you, in which case we would just click on the Submit button. But one thing I'd point out is that these keys are extremely important. Whenever you actually add devices into your network, a key will get used as part of that integration process. It sets it apart from other solutions out there. You've got these specific keys and they are very specific to your network. So the idea is, if your system were to break, so let's say you're running this on a physical computer, if the hardware breaks and you've got to replace it, you're going to have to completely rebuild the system. You're going to need these keys because the devices that are out there and already being integrated they're expecting to connect using whatever keys you've put in as part of the actual installation process here. So that's something to bear in mind though. But in this case, we're talking about just doing a completely fresh installation of the Z-Wave JS add-on. So what we're going to do is just click on submit and let the system create the keys for us. So that's now done, and it's actually given us a bit more helpful information, I must admit, by the fact that it's saying we found a device and it's a Z-Stick USB controller. A lot more informative than what we were getting back there, I must admit. But in any case, what you can do if you want, you can click on the drop down menu and put this in a specific area. You can create a new area if you haven't already created one. But because it's a controller, for me, I'm not going to be running any automations that tell the system to do something for this controller. So I'm just going to leave that blank, to be honest. But entirely up to you if you want to put it in a specific area. Either way, we'll click on finish. And that's the actual installation done. As you can see, it's actually created this integration, or rather installed the integration. So it's installed the integration and it's installed the add-on. So it's done the whole thing in one go. So Home Assistant is a lot easier to set up for Z-Wave now than it used to be. But in any case, I mean, it's not a great deal we can do around here. You can click on where it says the device and it gives you a list of the devices it knows of, for example. If we click on configure, you can go in and you can remove devices, you can heal your network, reconfigure, you can have a look at the logs. Not a great deal. But if we go over to configuration, if we go to add-ons, backups and supervisor, you can see it's actually installed the add-on itself. So if we click on the add-on, one thing I want to point out is we want to select this watchdog option. We want to enable that. So if the actual add-on were to have a crash at some point, the system will try and restart it again. We don't really want this to suddenly stop, to break, because if it does, the entire Z-Wave network stops. Home Assistant can't get access to your devices. By default, it'll start up on boot anyway, so that's great, but you do want to select that option. There's a documentation tab you can click on to get a bit more information. But one thing I'm going to point out is click on this configuration tab here. These are all the actual keys that were generated. Now, the network key and the S0 legacy key are the same, but all the rest are different. Either way, take a copy of all of this information, store it somewhere, whether that's in a password database manager that's got a strong password to protect it, whether it's on a file and on an encrypted drive or disk somewhere that's locked away. Keep a backup as well, because as I was pointing out earlier, the idea is if something were to go wrong, once you've got this all up and running and you've got your keys and you start adding devices in, depending on what the device is, I mean, we're into authenticated keys, for example, control keys. This is where we're getting into the realms of door controls, for example. They're a lot more secure than your normal device, shall we say. They need to be more secure. But either way, we want to keep a copy of all of these keys, because if the physical hardware breaks, assuming you're running it on a physical computer, you're going to have to rebuild Home Assistant from scratch. And these keys are essential because when the device gets added in, it's using one of these keys to get integrated into Home Assistant, into the Z-Wave network. And you have to have those keys to be able to communicate back to those devices again. Otherwise, you'd have to completely reset all of the devices and start all over again. So do keep all of this information safe. Anyway, our add-ons installed, our integrations installed, and now we're ready to start installing the actual devices. Now, if your USB device hasn't been recognized, then we're going to have to go through a more manual process of installing the software. So what we're going to do is click on Add-ons, Backups and Supervisor. Then we're going to go to the System tab, because we want to see if Home Assistant at least recognizes some USB device in there. So under this Host section, we'll click on the ellipsis button here and then select Hardware. And to make it a bit easier, we're going to just type in USB here to filter things out. As you can see, it's coming back with 3 different USB devices, but it's this one here that catches the eye, specifically because it's referencing it as a serial USB device. Now, there are devices out there that actually have something meaningful in the name. If you click on the drop-down menu, you might get something more meaningful out of that. In our case, I'm not getting anything useful at all out of this, I must admit, but in all fairness, this stands out. This you'll easily identify this when it comes to installing the add-on software. So I'm just going to click on the close button there. And then once that closes, I'm going to click on the add-ons tab. Then I'm going to click on add-on store. Now, if you installed the software because it was notified, this is the actual add-on that would get installed, Z-Wave-GS. So this is the official add-on. There is another community add-on for Z-Wave that you can use, but personally, and as a general rule of thumb, I just stick to the ones that the developers have actually created themselves. Less likelihood of something going wrong after a patch, for example, comes out. So we're going to click on Z-Wave-GS. Then we'll click on install, and then off it goes in and installs the software. Well, the software is now installed, and as you can see, it's set to boot on startup of the computer. What I would recommend is turning on this watchdog option. That way, if the actual add-on were to break, maybe a software bug or something, then Home Assistant will try to get it back up and running again. And it's extremely important, because if this software isn't running, you won't be able to get access to your devices. Now, before I click on Start, I need to actually configure the device, but you can click on the Documentation tab and get a bit more information out of this add-on, but I'm just going to jump straight to Configuration. And then what I've got to do is I've actually got to tell it which device to actually use. Like I say, this one stands out quite easily compared to the rest. So I'm going to click that, and that's just specifically because it references it as a serial device and a USB device. The rest are just TTY devices. Now, because this is a fresh install, I'm just going to click on Save. The options were, I could have filled in my own keys. So these are various keys of different purposes that get used in Z-Wave networks. And the idea is when you actually install or integrate a device, this is where the keys come into place as part of the integration. So because it's a completely new installation, I can either put the information in myself or just leave the system to generate them for me. And I'm just going to do that. I'm just going to let the system create them. They're just random numbers and letters, basically. One thing to point out is that if you're actually rebuilding Home Assistant, for example, say your physical computer that you're running it on breaks, you need to just rebuild the whole thing from scratch. Those Z-Wave devices that are out there know about these keys that were created as part of the original installation when they were integrated, and so you have to put the original keys back in again. So if you're actually doing a rebuild, you would actually put your keys back in here. So that's something to bear in mind. You wouldn't want to create new keys, you'd actually want to restore the original keys here. In any case, we're going to go back to the Info tab because we're just starting from scratch, and I'm going to click Start. So that then starts the add-on up. If you want, you can go and have a look at the Config tab and find out information. As it can tell you here, it's actually generating new keys because we didn't tell it about any. But if I go to the Configuration tab, it's empty. There's nothing there at the minute. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on Info, and I'm going to actually stop the add-on. And then once it's stopped, I'm actually going to start it up again. The reason for that is if I go back to the Configuration tab, we've now actually got our keys. So we've got two keys. We've got a network key and an S0 legacy key, which are identical. The rest are all different. And if you are going to create these keys yourself, that is what you want. These three here need to be different to what these two here. They've all got different purposes. I mean, when you're into authenticated keys, you're into smart door locks, for example, that need to be a lot more secure. But one thing I'll point out is keep a backup of these. Keep them in a database manager, for example, a password database manager that's got a strong password to get access to it. Keep it in a file on an encrypted drive, whatever it is to keep that information safe. Don't make this public information. It doesn't really matter for me because this is just a virtual machine and it'll just get erased afterwards anyway. But the key point is this is incredibly important because, like I was saying before, if you need to rebuild this, you need these original keys. If you don't have these keys when you rebuild, the Z-Wave-GS software, you're going to have problems where the actual devices won't work, and you're going to have to essentially start from scratch. You have to create completely new keys. You'll have to factory reset your Z-Wave devices and add them all back in again manually. So this is just going to save you a lot of trouble later down the line. Anyway, we've now got our add-on installed. So the next thing to do is to install the integration. So we'll go over to Configuration, then over to Devices and Services. Now, because Home Assistant had recognized this USB device anyway, we've got this discovery option, but if you weren't seeing this notification, you wouldn't be seeing this either. So we're going to click on Add Integration and do this ourselves. And then if I type in just wave, I've got zwave.me and zwave.gs. So that's the one we want, zwave.gs. We'll select that, and then we actually want to select this device here. So this is the USB device we identified earlier. We also know it's ACM0 in this case, so we'll select that device for the one we want to use for this integration. So we'll click on that, and then we'll click on Submit, and then that's it. It's now come back and it's actually given us some more useful information, saying this is a Z-Stick USB controller. We've got a choice where we can put it into a specific area. You can even create new areas, because out of the box we've got, by default we've got 3 areas that Home Assistant creates anyway. But because I'm not going to create any rules that are relevant to this specific controller, I'm just going to leave the area blank, but it's entirely up to you. In any case, just click on Finish, and that completes the installation of the integration. And then you've got choices. I mean, if you need to go back to the add-on, for example, go to Configuration, Add-ons, Backups, and Supervisor. We can click on our add-on, do whatever it is we need to do there. And we come back to Configuration again, back up to Devices and Services. We've got our integration itself where we can configure that. So we can remove devices from the network, we can heal the network, reconfigure the server and so on, get access to the logs. You can also click on this option for in this case there is only one device, but if you click on that link, it usually gives you like a list of all the devices it knows. This is the only one it knows at the moment, the actual controller, but that's something to bear in mind for future purposes. But now the key point is the actual add-on software is installed, the integration's installed, and so now we can start to integrate Z-Wave devices. Now, before we actually integrate any new Z-Wave devices into this wireless network that we've got here, it helps to actually plan things out a bit. So at this stage, we've just got one device in our Z-Wave network, and that's the actual controller itself. And as a general rule of thumb, it helps to actually start with devices that are going to be closest to Home Assistant, and then slowly work your way outwards. That way you'll end up with a much more reliable and stable network, because any device that's out there on the edge, for instance, will talk to its closest neighbor, and then you'll start to get messages reeling backwards and forwards over this mesh network. So it's a lot better if you plan it out that way first. But having said that, you actually want the powered devices up and running first. You want those integrated, and by that I'm talking about devices that can be run from USB power, for example. Battery operated devices, well, as soon as you take the battery out, they're going to stop working. So you don't really want those to be the key enablers within your wireless mesh. So start with devices that are closest to the actual Home Assistant itself. We're talking about ones that you plug into the actual mains, and then slowly work your way out, and then start to add in the actual battery devices after. Now, if we want to add a new Z-Wave device to our network, we need to go to Configuration here, then select Devices and Services, and then we need to click on this Configure option for our Z-Wave GS integration. Once we do that, we've got an option down here which is to add a device. And then what that does is it puts Home Assistant into what's called inclusion mode, and it starts actually listening out for new Z-Wave devices to join. There are some devices out there where you can actually use a QR code and get the device to scan that code and add it in. But typically for most devices out there, what you're going to do is put that device into inclusion mode as well, and then the 2 devices will sync up with each other. Now, how you put a Z-Wave device into inclusion mode really depends on the device itself. So I would recommend reading the actual manual that comes with it to get a better understanding of what it is you need to do. In the case of this device, as an example, just below where my finger is, there's a button. Now, I've taken the battery out so it doesn't obscure the camera, but the idea is that once it's actually got the battery in, I need to wake it up and I need to put it into inclusion mode. And that means basically rapidly clicking on that button a certain number of times. And then once it goes into inclusion mode, it'll then sync up with Home Assistant. So I'm going to put the battery in, and then we'll add this to our network. Now that Home Assistant's in inclusion mode and I've got the battery in this device, I'm going to put the device into inclusion mode, and then the 2 will sync up. So just checking. It looks as though the 2 are going to start. Yep, so there they go. So Home Assistant's now talking with this device, assuming that it's compatible, it'll start to gather information about it, and then hopefully it'll finish the process off. Now, sometimes it doesn't always do that, but in this case it does. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to click View Device. Well, I'm just going to close this window. I'll put my device down. So this is actually a motion sensor, and it's got what I call a lot of sensors within it. So it's a motion sensor device, but it's got things like it will report the air temperature, it reports motion detection, the luminance, seismic intensity, and so on. But what we want to do really is rename this, because just calling it motion sensor doesn't really make much sense. So I'm going to click on that pen there, and I'm going to call it the kitchen motion sensor, because I want to put it into the kitchen. So there's its name, and there's the area, and we click on Update. So that at least makes it a bit more easy to identify. So if I go back to my device list here, we've got 2 devices. At least now I've got something meaningful. There's a kitchen motion sensor, and it's in the area kitchen. If I click on Overview, all of these parts of the actual motion sensor that we can take advantage of are getting identified here and added into the dashboard. So straight away we're getting information about luminance levels, air temperature, and so on. I mean, if I move my hand over the actual motion sensor, you can see it's detected motion and so on. But what we can do is we can click on each individual device here if you want, or each sensor if you will, and start making changes here, for instance. Or what you can do is you can just go back to the configuration tab option there, click on devices and services. We go over to our Z-Wave JS integration, click on here where it says however many devices you've got. Gives us a list of devices, and then you can select the actual device itself and work your way through those sensors in this case. Now, when it comes to things like motion sensors in particular, I would really recommend reading the manual, because if we click on configure device here, there's a lot of parameters in here. It sets sensitivity levels, whether it reports information, how often it reports information, and so on, which these are things you need to tweak, and you really need to be looking at the manual to understand what these are. The sensors themselves, if we click on one of these, so let's say I'll click the air temperature one as an example. The name, I mean, that's not too bad. I mean, it says it's the kitchen motion sensor and it's an air temperature. So from a name perspective, that makes sense. The problem is the entity ID. When you configure rules, you reference the entity ID. And the problem is motion sensor air temperature doesn't really mean much. If I've got a lot of these motion sensors, how do I know which area it's in, for example? So I like to rename these to something more useful. So you leave the actual type of entity as is, which is a sensor. It's just a name after that dot or period that you want to change. What you want to call is entirely up to you. I mean, I could just leave it as kitchen air temperature, for example, if I don't have any other air temperature devices. And then I'll click on update, and it means going forward, I'll be able to reference it by a more meaningful name in the rules. I can easily identify what kitchen air temperature is, whereas before it just was a motion sensor's air temperature. And I can do that with other devices, other sensors, I should say, within here. Now, there's some of them that I'm not particularly interested in, but by default, they're all showing up within the actual dashboard. Again, I mean, I can go through that process of going through the configuration option down here and working my way through, but I can also just click directly on the device. So let's say, for instance, I'm not particularly interested in this option here. So we click on that. If I click on the cog, and then under advanced settings, what I could do is you've got choices. You could hide it, which means it's still in use, it's just hidden. Or you can completely disable it if you're not interested in it at all. Now, in my particular case, I'm just going to leave it there. I'm not, to be honest, I'm not actually going to be using that particular feature, but I'm just going to select the hidden option instead. Click on update. So that was the x-axis one. If we come back to overview, hit refresh, and I've got to log back in again. We want to see basically has this disappeared from the actual dashboard altogether. So you can see that's now disappeared. I mean, the alternative would be just to, if I click on that one, click on the cog, we'll go to advanced, select hidden, click update. It's still there, so I'm going to go to the energy option, for example, come back again, and it's disappeared. For some strange reason, I don't know why, it's a strange security feature maybe, but if ever you do like a refresh of Home Assistant, and even if you like ask to open up a specific one in a separate tab, for example, it insists you log back in again. But the easiest thing is just click somewhere else, come back to the dashboard, and as you can see, it's disappeared. But the key thing is, those particular sensors, they're still available to me within rules, whereas if I'd actually disabled them, then that would be it. I wouldn't be able to touch them at all after that. So it really depends. I mean, those ones are part like the tamper proofing and so on, but you can have all sorts of little sensors, maybe for different devices. You can get power outlets that'll give you power outage, power details. You know, they don't just like turn on and off the actual device. They even report the actual power utilization. So it's very easy to actually install and integrate new devices. But if it's a case of you don't want a device and you actually want to get rid of it, we then want to actually remove the device. And again, it's a two-way process unless the device has actually failed. So what we'll do next is to actually remove this device from Home Assistant. Now, for whatever reason, you may actually have a Z-Wave device that you just no longer need any use for, in which case we actually want to remove it from Home Assistant. But we don't want to just simply delete it. We actually want to remove this device from our Z-Wave network. We want a nice, clean, orderly removal. And to do that, we actually have to put our Home Assistant into exclusion mode, and we have to do the same thing for the actual device itself. So in this case, I can just click on the Integrations tab here, and then click on Configure, or we can go down to Configuration, Devices and Services, and then click on Configure from there. So once we click that button, there's an option down here to remove device, so we'll click that. And then I've got a button down here called Start Exclusion. So this is going to put Home Assistant into exclusion mode. So then pick up my device, just rapidly click the button on this one, and there we go. The two have actually talked to each other, and they've basically just decided that that's it, we no longer need to talk to one another. And so that device has now been removed from my Z-Wave network. So I'm just going to click on the Close button. It still says there's two devices, but if I click on the Logs tab, then on the Network tab, you can see it's now gone. So I'll click on Devices, and it's just now the actual USB controller that's left within this Z-Wave network. So that makes a lot more sense. As long as the device is actually still functioning, and if you just don't need it anymore for whatever reason, then do a proper exclusion. If, on the other hand, you're actually having problems with a device, that's another way you can do it. You can actually exclude a device from the network, and then you can re-include it back again to see if that fixes your problem. Now, if for some reason Home Assistant can't talk to a device anymore, and it looks as though it's genuinely broken, so we can't go through that clean exclusion mode process, then the only option is to literally delete it from Home Assistant. Now, from the perspective of a Z-Wave network like this, we're going to use this option here, which is to remove a failed device. So you need to be in the actual configuration for the device itself. So we could go to Configuration, Devices and Services. We then go over to the devices that are specific to our Z-Wave GS here. Pick that device, and then we would click that button, Remove Failed Device. And then we then would, get this warning saying, it's a last resort. And then, and only then, do you click on Remove Device to actually literally remove it altogether from Home Assistant. So it is a last resort. Do what you can to try and get a clean removal using exclusion. But if you have to, then yeah, you'll have to go through that option there to remove a failed device. Now, when you include a Z-Wave device into your Z-Wave network, Home Assistant, for instance, might not actually finish off the process of gathering all the information about that device. Typically, if you just leave it, the device will wake back up again after a set period of time, and Home Assistant will be able to gather extra information. But if you're having problems where there seems to be certain parts, sensors, for instance, that are missing, for instance, what you can do is actually click on this Re-Interview Device option. So to get to here, we go to Configuration, go to Devices and Services, we then go to Z-Wave-GS now, devices here. I do that because you can't go on the devices tab there, but when you've got a lot of devices, and you've got a lot of different types of integrations. It can be hard to find a specific one, but in this case I'm just going to click on that list there because it narrows it down a bit more. Click on the actual device itself and it brings us to this page, and then what you can do is click on this re-interview device option. And like it says, do that if something seems to be missing or not working quite well. But it does warn you, though, you need to wake the device back up again to be able to do this. So in any case, what we can do is click on Start Re-Interview, but I've got to wake it up first. So I'm going to just rapidly click on this device. And there we go. It's starting to interrogate it and find out information. So it's going to go through the same process, but bear in mind that when you're dealing with battery operated devices, every time you're doing this, you're really stressing the battery and taking a lot of power out of it. So it's usually best to leave it to itself. Usually sometimes they'll have about like a 4-hour time window. Some might be longer, but leave it, come back the next day, find out if it's sorted itself out, because they do wake back up every now and again anyway. But that's just something that you might find useful. Well, hopefully you'll see now that configuring Home Assistant to take advantage of Z-Wave devices is pretty straightforward, especially if Home Assistant actually recognises the USB controller that you've got. After that, it's just a process of going through the actual wizard. And adding the devices themselves is pretty straightforward as well. You just need to put Home Assistant into inclusion mode and then put the actual device into inclusion mode as well. And the two will have a conversation, and the next thing you know, you've now got a device added to your Home Assistant network. Well, thanks for making it to the end of this video. I really do hope you found it useful. If so, then do click the like button and share, as that'll help get the video out to more people who might find it useful as well. If you've got any comments or suggestions, please post those in the comments section below. And if you're new to the channel and you'd like to see more content like this, then yes, do subscribe. Just remember to set the bell icon to actually send you notifications when new content gets released, although I also post to Twitter as well as Facebook. If you'd like to help the channel and support it, you can actually make contributions through PayPal and Buy Me a Coffee. I've also got links to Patreon, and there's also the join membership option for YouTube itself. Patreon and YouTube members do have the option to actually benefit from early access as well. But above all, many thanks for watching this video. I'll see you in the next one.